Pierre Morcos and dear participants, welcome to a very special webinar on France, Indo-Pacific and the AUKUS. NICE is an independent, apolitical, non-partisan think tank based in Kathmandu that undertake independent research and activities on issues of international relations, foreign policy, security studies, and issue of development. Today we'll be discussing about different aspects of Indo-Pacific affairs, AUKUS, and France. To talk on this very interesting topic, which is very important, today we have Pierre Morcos. Pierre Morcos is a visiting fellow in the Europe, Russia, and Eurasia Program at the Center for Strategic and International Studies, US, where he focuses on European security issues. A career diplomat from the French Foreign Service, he most recently served as deputy head of the Strategic Affairs and Cybersecurity Division, focusing on NATO and European defense issues. His expertise include defense budget, defense industry, acquisition and innovation, defense strategy and capabilities, defense and security, European Union, geopolitics and international security, such as NATO. He's also NATO. He's trained as a civil servant in the National School of Administration, Ecole Nationale Administration, and holds bachelor's and master's in public administration from Paris Institute of Political Science, Science Board. Marcos, you will have around 20 minutes to 25 minutes maximum to make your remarks, which will be followed by question and answers. The program is streaming live on several Facebook pages. Hence, we would like to request all our participants to drop their questions on the Facebook Live or in Zoom chat box. Please do share and tweet about the event and tag us at Contact NICE. Marcos, over to you. Thank you.
Thank you so much, and thank you for your kind invitation. It's a real pleasure to have the opportunity to discuss with you this important topic of France in the Indo-Pacific in the context of this diplomatic row with Washington, Canberra, and London. First, let me present you some backgrounds about France and the Indo-Pacific, because I think it's important to have in mind what is France's role and presence in the region before tackling the issue of the ongoing crisis following the announcement of AUKUS last September 15. So first, a few basic facts about France and the Indo-Pacific. I think it's important to have in mind that France has a strong human, geographical, and economic connection with the region. France often defines itself as an Indo-Pacific nation because actually we have overseas territories across the region with islands such as Mayotte and La Réunion in the Indian Ocean and islands such as New Caledonia and French Polynesia in the Pacific Ocean. And these islands, these overseas territories, are home to at least 1.6 million French nationals, and also provides to France the second largest exclusive economic zone in the world before the United States. So that's why also France has quite a strong military footprint across the region. We have naval bases in these islands, more than 7,000 soldiers permanently deployed there. It's quite significant. It's more than the French soldiers deployed in the Sahel, for instance, which is our biggest external operations. So it's quite telling about the importance of the region for France. And beyond these soldiers, we have also dozens of ships which are pre-positioned in the region. And the main goal of this military footprint is to protect the sovereignty of France at land and at sea, and to combat illegal trafficking, illegal fishing, also to provide assistance in case of a natural disaster. So they have plentiful missions to ensure the sovereignty of France. So that's the basic facts. Now, a few words about the French strategy for the Indo-Pacific, because France, such as Japan in 2007 or Australia in 2013, France embraced also the concept of Indo-Pacific in 2018 when President Macron visited the region in India, in Australia, and unveiled the French strategy for the Indo-Pacific. And the fact that France embraced that concept signaled two things. First, the first fact is that France has a broad vision of the region and sees the two oceans, the Indian Ocean and the Pacific Ocean, as interconnected, as a continuum. And actually France places equal importance to the two oceans. And the French geographical definition of Indo-Pacific is quite broad. It starts from Djibouti, so the east coast of Africa, to the South Pacific. And this definition is actually broader than the US one, which stopped at India. The second element is that France attaches huge importance about the stability of the region. We believe that this stability is key for our sovereignty, for our economic prosperity, but also for the stability of the world order. And the main concern of Paris is the growing rivalry between Washington and Beijing and the risk of military escalation between the two powers, especially in a context where there is no real regional architecture in the region, contrary to other parts of the world, such as Europe. So there is a clear risk of military escalation, and France, in response to that, promotes a concept of a stable, rules-based and open Indo-Pacific, which is quite similar to the definition made by India, Japan, or Australia. In a more concrete way, the French strategy is divided into three main priorities. The first one is to improve the military balance in the region and to balance the Chinese growing assertiveness across the region. And to do so, France has adopted strategic partnerships with many actors of the region. This was the case with Australia as early as 2012, and it was reinforced by our Submarine program. I will discuss that later, of course. This is also the case with India, with Japan, South Korea, Indonesia, New Zealand, Singapore. So our network of partnerships is quite important in the region and encompasses different military activities, such as arms cooperation. So it was the case, of course, with Australia and also with India, who bought 36 Rafale, which are fighter aircrafts. It entails also enhanced information sharing, joint maritime exercises, which are plentiful in the region, and France actually regularly deploys naval assets in the region. In 2019, it deployed its aircraft carrier, Charles de Gaulle, in the region. It also regularly deployed frigates, amphibious groups, and that this year, France deployed for the first time an attack submarine. And when these naval assets are deployed, they're regularly trained with their partners, notably with the US, with Australia, with India, with Japan. They also often sail through the South China Sea to reassert the commitment of France to the freedom of navigation. And that's an important element of France. So clearly, this first bucket clearly demonstrates that France is willing to compete militarily with China, because we believe that Chinese assertiveness could destabilize the region. Having said that, France is in no way in a confrontational stance toward Beijing, and the end goal of France is to propose to the countries of the region an alternative model to the Chinese one, and that is the second pillar of the French strategy. It is multilateralism. France is part of many regional organizations and fora because of its overseas territories. Just to give you an example, France in the Indian Ocean is part of the Indian Ocean Commission, of the Indian Ocean Naval Symposium, and the Indian Ocean RIP Association. And France, through this fora, tries to promote cooperative solutions in terms of maritime security, the protection of the environment, information sharing, connectivity, to make sure that the countries of the region are not in a bilateral, only on a bilateral dialogue with Beijing, but have other alternatives. The third pillar, which is quite interesting of the French strategy, is the European dimension of our strategy. France tries to push Europeans to have a stronger role and engagement in the region. For instance, when France deploys its naval assets, it brings with it Europeans. When our aircraft carrier was deployed in the region, there were also naval assets from Denmark or Portugal or Belgium, which sailed alongside with our aircraft carrier group. France also has promoted the participation of the European Union in regional fora, and as early as December 2020, the EU adopted a strategic partnership with ASEAN, and this was an important progress in the relationship between the two organizations. And France also has played a driving role in the adoption of the first EU Indo-Pacific strategy, which was released last week, actually 2 weeks before, so the day after the announcement of AUKUS. And it's quite telling that this strategy was unveiled the day after that. And the Indo-Pacific strategy so has these 3 dimensions: competing militarily with China, promoting multilateralism across the region to offer an alternative model, and promoting also the role of Europeans in the region. So now let me talk about the diplomatic disputes following AUKUS, which is the topic of today. And I think maybe you can understand now why this announcement was experienced as a huge blow for Paris. When the announcement was made by President Biden, Prime Minister Morrison, and Prime Minister Johnson on September 15, it came clearly as a complete surprise and shock in France. And Paris took quite strong diplomatic decisions, and notably recalled for the first time its ambassador to the US and its ambassador to Australia. This is quite unprecedented, and the idea was to signal how France was angry about that decision. But why? I would say at least for 2 reasons. First, France, the submarine program between France and Australia, which was launched in 2016 and was clearly ongoing and satisfying actually the Australian authorities, was more than just an industrial contract. It was part of a broader strategic partnership between France and Australia, which entails different dimensions, not only the production of submarines for Australia, but also a program of exercises, of information sharing, of technological transfers, of also mutual access to our naval bases, because it's important to have in mind that France shares borders with Australia. We are a neighbor of Australia, so it's clearly essential for the 2 of us to cooperate and to promote and to contribute to the stability of the Pacific Ocean and the Indo-Pacific. And this partnership was supposed to last at least 50 years. So it was clearly a long-term partnership. And AUKUS actually simply excluded France from this crucial partnership with Australia and promoted this alternative offer, the production of nuclear-powered submarines by the US with the support of the UK at the expense of the French-Australian partnership. And clearly, it has an impact on France's strategy in the region. So that's the first element. It's not only about the loss of an industrial contract, it's about an impact, a limitation of France's strategy, and the fact that the Biden administration had a divisive approach. Instead of including France, it excluded France in a context where actually cooperation would be preferred. The second reason of France's discontent was the fact that France was not consulted beforehand by Canberra or Washington. Clearly, these negotiations started many months ago, and France was kept in the dark throughout the negotiations, even though the French authorities discussed and tackled that issue specifically with the US Australian authorities on many occasions. Just let me give you two striking examples. For instance, Secretary Blinken, the US Secretary of State, visited France on June 25. He met with our minister, Jean-Yves Le Drian, and the issue of the future of the French-Australian submarine was discussed, and Minister Le Drian mentioned that it was important to sustain that program, which was also in the interest of the US because the US industry was part of the French-Australian program. It is important also to have that fact in mind. Lockheed Martin was in charge of the armament dimension of the program. And in response, Secretary Blinken reassured the French Foreign Minister about US commitment to this program, while actually at the same time, the US was negotiating an alternative offer to the French program. So clearly there was a strong duplicity there. Second example, the French and Australian defense and foreign ministers met in a 2+2 format on August 30. It was the first time that they met in that important format. They adopted a bilateral roadmap in which they notably stressed their commitment to the future submarine program. So 2 weeks before the announcement of AUKUS, the Australian authorities stressed the importance of that program. And actually, the day of the announcement of AUKUS, Paris received a letter from Canberra confirming the launching of the second phase of the program. So there was a huge gap between what our Australian and US counterparts told us and the reality of their negotiations with the US. So that's why this event was seen and experienced as a breach of trust, to take the words used by our Foreign Minister Jean-Yves Le Drian. And he also mentioned a stab in the back. So it's quite a powerful language, but it's also revealing how Paris is furious about the way these negotiations were handled, especially between close allies, France, the US, Australia. Regarding that partnership, France has also some doubts and questions. The first question is about the actual added value of AUKUS from strictly an industrial and military standpoint, because the French program was supposed to start the production of submarines in Australia in 2023, so in a few years, and the first submarine was supposed to be delivered in 2033, 2034. While the AUKUS program has not a clear calendar, it's just the project of a project of 18 months to determine what could be the conditions of the production of a nuclear-powered submarine. So there are huge uncertainties about this program, and it won't necessarily benefit Australia from an operational standpoint. And the second question, which is more I would say, geopolitical, is about the signal sent by the US, UK, and Australia through AUKUS, and the signal sent notably to Beijing. The French authorities have questions about the overemphasis on security and defense and on confrontation through AUKUS, while France has promoted, as I said, a more balanced approach. Of course, Paris is aware of the assertiveness of China, notably in the South China Sea, and is ready to compete with China, but also tries to avoid feuding the confrontation with Beijing and tries to promote an alternative order and cooperative solutions. While AUKUS is uniquely focused on the security dimension of the competition with Beijing. So clearly France has questions about the coherence of France's approach, which is shared with the European Union, as I said, but also with other countries of the region, India, Japan, South Korea, Indonesia, and this new approach favored by the US, Australia, and the UK. Now, let me finish by a few words about the next steps. What do we do now after this huge diplomatic dispute, and quite a unique one between France, the US, the UK, and Australia? First, the US and France have resumed the dialogue after at least 1 week of dispute. As you may know, President Macron and President Biden spoke on the phone last week. President Biden recognized that this issue should have been handled differently, and he accepted to launch in-depth consultations with France to clarify our strategies and to find areas of cooperations, of increased cooperations between France and the US, notably when it comes to the Indo-Pacific, but also the fight against terrorism in the Sahel, and also the promotion of the European defense. Now our ambassador has come back to the US yesterday. He already met with the National Security Advisor of President Biden, Jake Sullivan, and they are launching a series of high-level consultations between the two administrations to discuss these issues. And the two presidents are supposed to meet again in Europe in a few weeks. So we are starting to resuming the dialogue. It's not the end of the crisis, as the French authorities have made it clear. It's the beginning of a process to rebuild trust between our two countries, but I hope that this crisis will be an opportunity to have more balanced and trust-based relations between France and the US. For now, we don't have a similar process with Australia and the UK, and clearly the ball is in their court, and we wait them for proposals and to restart the dialogue. Clearly, France will not take the first step. We will wait them to ignite a form of dialogue. The second and last remark about the next step is the fact that France will not leave the region. As I said, we have territories there. We are deeply linked to the region. So we won't turn our back to the Indo-Pacific region. Quite the contrary, France will actually deepen its partnerships with other countries. Our minister was in New York at the United Nations last week, and he met on the margins of the General Assembly his Indian, Indonesian, and Japanese counterparts, and they had fruitful discussions on these issues. And France also will continue to promote a stronger European engagement in the region. And as you may know, France will have the presidency of the European Union next year on the first semester of 2022. This is an important moment because France will determine the agenda of the European Union and will play clearly a driving role in the organization, and the Indo-Pacific will be one of our priorities during these 6 months. And notably, the foreign ministers of Europe will meet with their Indo-Pacific counterparts on a dedicated meeting on that, and France will try to implement the Indo-Pacific strategy of the European Union. So clearly, France will continue to be active in the region. The big question mark is how France will continue to cooperate with the US, Australia, and the UK, and that's for now an open question. That's the end of my presentation. Thank you for listening, and I'm looking forward to your question.
Morcos, thank you so much for the comprehensive presentation. You have touched upon all the major aspects of France, Indo-Pacific, and AUKUS. We have received lots of questions, mostly evolving around AUKUS. So let me start with a very general question first, which many have asked, like, how important is Indo-Pacific for France? Why do you think France was excluded from AUKUS?
As I said, the Indo-Pacific is important for France, not only because we have economic ties with the region as other European nations, but because, as I said, we have territories there. So what is at stake is not only our prosperity, it's our sovereignty. We have the second largest exclusive economic zone in the world, and clearly these maritime zones are also impacted by the instability of the region. And more largely, France believes, as many other countries, that the Indo-Pacific is at the core of the world order, at the core of the stability of the world. And if this region is unstable, it will necessarily have an impact on our security. So we deeply value the stability of the Indo-Pacific. And why was France excluded? That's clearly one of the biggest questions France has. We do not understand why, because Australia clearly wanted to have another design for their submarines. They wanted to have nuclear-powered submarines instead of conventionally powered submarines, which were provided by France. But actually, France has this technology also. French submarines are nuclear-powered. So theoretically, France could have provided such technology to Australia. The main problem is the fact that Australia never mentioned, never put on the table this question with the French authorities. So we never discussed that. We never had an opportunity to evaluate and assess our ability or not, our willingness or not to provide such technology. So clearly, I think that France was excluded because the main goal of Australia was not necessarily acquiring this technology. It was to signal that it was more closed to Washington and to forge a strong alliance with Washington in a context where the tensions between Beijing and Canberra are rising, and the calculus of Canberra was to forge this alliance, to signal that they were strong and close allies to the US, even though that meant to exclude France, and that's clearly disappointing.
Morcos, let me go to second question, which you have already touched upon. What is the reason behind France's dissatisfaction towards America?
I think the main elements of our disappointments is this breach of trust. We hoped that with the new US administration, we would be able to resume a trust-based dialogue, transparent and frank dialogue with the Biden administration. And our first contacts were very positive with the new US administration. And we have really good and fruitful discussions with them As you know, President Biden visited Europe in June. It was his first international trip. Secretary Blinken went to Paris. Our ministers for Foreign Affairs and Defense also visited Washington last July. So clearly, there was a positive momentum between our two countries. But actually, it was just a facade, because in parallel, there were these secret negotiations which were clearly at the expense of French economic and security interests. And that's why France is so angry about it. It is this huge gap between these reassuring words coming from Washington and the reality of their actions, which are in a sense quite similar to the previous administration, the Trump administration. And that's why France is so disappointed. And for Paris, actually, it's not an AP phenomenon. It's not only limited to this dispute. It's part of a larger trend coming from Washington of a US foreign policy more and more focused on the Indo-Pacific, on its core national interests, at the expense sometimes of Europe. And we experienced a similar situation with the rapid withdrawal of of the United States from Afghanistan, where clearly many European allies which were deployed in Afghanistan. It was not the case of France, but for instance, Germany or the UK were deeply committed to Afghanistan, and they were presented clearly with the fait accompli last April, when the Biden administration informed them unilaterally that they decided to withdraw their troops, and they imposed their calendar to them, and it led to the fall of Kabul and the disaster we know. So clearly there is a trend of a US administration which is not necessarily transparent and does not necessarily consult genuinely its European allies. So this is a broader problem in the transatlantic relation.
What strategic impact would AUKUS have in Indo-Pacific and Quad? This is a general question, not related to France, but how do you look at it?
It has to be determined. My main concern is that this new alliance might provoke a fragmentation in the region, because clearly this partnership is focusing, as I said, overly on security and defense and the military competition with China, while other countries of the region are a bit uneased about this balance. Actually, before many countries were reluctant to fully align with the US and to fully engage in this military competition and rivalry between Beijing and Washington. This was the case previously of Australia. This is still the case of South Korea, Japan, Indonesia, India, and other countries. So clearly, I think Washington will have to clarify what are the implications of AUKUS and what it means about their overall strategy of the region. And if their strategy is to only and primarily focus on their military competition with China, it could pose problem for many countries of the region, because, as I said, at least for France, our strategy also, of course, recognize the necessary military balance of China, but also is concerned of not fueling the tensions and of promoting alternative offers and also acting on the environment, trade, connectivity, and so on, and not only on military issues. So AUKUS could make cooperations with different countries of the region more complicated for Washington. Clearly, it complicates the cooperation with France and necessarily and potentially with Europe at large. That's why the ongoing discussions between Washington and Paris are paramount to clarify the coherence of their strategies.
Marcos, you just mentioned about China, so let's have more clarity on it. Do you think France? Do you see France and Russia or France and China building closer ties with AUKUS agreement after this AUKUS agreement?
No, to be clear, no. I think that France has stated many times that even though it does not want to fully align with Washington to contribute to the rivalry between Beijing and Washington, Paris is well aware that we share the same values with Washington, democratic values. We are allies, notably through NATO. So we are not in equidistance between Beijing and Washington. We are closer to Washington than to Beijing. And France also is concerned by the aggressive and destabilizing actions of China across the region, notably when it comes to their actions against the freedom of navigation in the South China Sea. So I don't see an alignment, not at all, between Paris and Beijing. And the same goes also with Russia. France also is well aware of the aggressive posture of Russia, notably in Europe. And actually France is part of the deterrence posture of NATO to ensure that Russia does not attack the east flank of NATO. France has deployed troops and battle tanks in the Baltic states, for instance. So clearly on the border with Russia. So that's clear. But having said that, also France is aware that we need to talk with China and Russia. Our strategy does not exclude any form of cooperation with these two countries. We actually believe that cooperation is needed in issues of shared interests, notably the environment, which is one of the biggest priorities of France, as you know. So on the environment, on the fight against climate change, for instance, dialogue cooperation is needed with Russia and China. Similarly, we need also to talk about arms control and how to mitigate the destabilizing effect of their new weapon systems. And France also is in favor of a dialogue with Beijing and Moscow on these issues. And actually, the US has such dialogues. Yesterday, the US and Russia met, for instance, to discuss arms control issues. To make a long story short, France and Europe at large presents China both as a strategic rival, as I said, not only when it comes to values, as a competitor, notably in the economic realm, and as a potential partner, notably when it comes to climate. And these three dimensions are important, and France does not exclude any of these dimensions.
We've got another interesting question, which I would like to put it right now. Like, as AUKUS has put the allies, India and Japan, in ambiguity, how would this tribe expect to win China without any ally in Asia?
Could you repeat your question? Excuse me.
Like this agreement of AUKUS, it was it came without what you call like it was not known to France. It was neither known to Japan and India, who are part of this Indo-Pacific, or you can say this strategy or Quad. So since AUKUS has put the allies, India and Japan, in ambiguity, how do you think Australia, US, and UK expect to win China without any allies in Asia, which is Japan and India?
I think that the situation for India, Japan is a bit different. These two countries were not part of the Submarine program with Australia. So the degree of consultation needed with them was not necessarily the same. Clearly, France should have been consulted beforehand, clearly. I don't necessarily know if it was needed for Japan and India. And actually, they did not complain about that at all. They just noticed this agreement. I don't know if they welcomed it, but at least they noticed it, and they did not mention that they should have been consulted beforehand. So I don't think that the way the negotiations were handled could have an impact on the cooperation with India and Japan. The big question mark I mentioned is what it means about US strategy in the region, what it means about US military strategy toward Beijing. And I'm sure that New Delhi and Tokyo have similar questions as France, and doubts maybe about the imbalance between this military angle and the other dimensions of the competition. So this clarification of the US strategy is needed not only for France, but I think also for other countries of the region, which were, as France, mindful of striking a balance between the different dimensions of their competition with Beijing.
Morcos, since we come from South Asia, maybe many of the questions are on India, like whether India can play a role in AUKUS. Do you think India can play a significant role in AUKUS in the future?
It's hard to tell. AUKUS has a huge, the main bulk of the agreement is about submarines and the production of nuclear powered submarines. I think, but it's only my opinion, that this part of the program will be limited to the US, UK, and Australia, because this is a highly sensitive technology. There is also a question of non-proliferation, which is also sensitive. So I think that the three countries will keep that box closed to others. Then there are other dimensions when it comes to cooperation on technologies and other issues, and maybe the US will try to broaden the cooperation to other countries, but still I think it will be limited, and that's the main problem of AUKUS. It's exclusive dimension, the fact that it excludes many other countries, while beforehand we have clearly a more inclusive approach in the region. And there were, of course, different groupings, different formats, but they were not excluding each other. Actually, there were many overlapping and complementing each other. Now we have this military alliance, which is a bit tricky to articulate with other groupings, and that's the main problem.
Thank you, Marcus. How do you see AUKUS and France coming together in the Indo-Pacific? Do you think that they can come together and work together in the region?
This is the biggest question mark. I honestly don't know. For the time being, the French authorities believe that AUKUS is incompatible with their own strategy in the region because, as I said, of this focus and prioritization of military competition. So I think that this will be resolved by our high-level dialogues with Washington, and I hope that both countries will manage to find a middle path and be able to cooperate together, because from a military standpoint, the cooperation with France and the US in the region is key. And over the past few months, we actually noticed a growing military cooperation between the two armed forces. Just to give you 3 examples, I mentioned before that we deployed a submarine in the region from France to the Indo-Pacific. So this was a long journey, and the submarine notably made port calls in Australia and in the US, in the Guam Island. Another example, France, the US, and Japan trained also in the Kyushu Island a few months ago to drill on a scenario of the protection of a remote island. So this was an amphibious exercise, quite also revealing of the depth of the defense ties between the two countries. And one last example, in July, 3 Rafale aircrafts were projected from France to Polynesia in less than 2 days. This was a unique exercise, and they did only one stop in California and then exercised with F-22 in Hawaii. Also another example of the strong defense ties between France and the US. So from a military standpoint, we need each other. Cooperation is important. Now the huge stumbling block is political, diplomatic. We do not have enough trust. We do not know if our strategies are compatible. So we need to resolve that diplomatic hurdle before resuming this meal cooperation, which was ongoing and which is important.
Let me get back to France again. Like France is devastated by agreement between US and UK. Also, France call out their ambassadors from US and UK. Unexpected agreement between US and Australia and UK shocked the European Union and France, which was also in NATO. In such a situation, how can France deal with it? What should be its roadmap? I mean, how it can overcome this crisis at the moment?
First, the goal of France is not to break ties with the US, Australia, or the UK. We are close allies and partners. When it comes to the UK and the US, we are part of the same alliance, NATO, and we closely cooperate on very different other issues, such as the fight against terrorism in the Sahel or in the Levant, the negotiations with Iran and their nuclear program, just to name a few. The goal of France is to resume a dialogue with these countries, but on a new base and a new way that we can trust each other. We can be more frank, transparent. We can have also more balanced discussion. And that's why we have such process with Washington, which is not just a single phone call between the two presidents. This is a process, a long-term process. The two presidents will meet again, as I said, in a few weeks in Europe. Our two administrations will have in-depth consultations. So clearly there is a shared desire to resume dialogue and to rebuild trust. It's hard to tell about Australia and the UK. At the end of the day, I hope that we will resume cooperation because there is a rationale for cooperation. But as I said, Canberra and London have to make the first step. Paris won't do so. They breached our trust, so it's their responsibility to rebuild that. I hope that they will understand that and make some concessions to restart the cooperation with France.
We are running out of time. We hardly have 5 to 7 minutes, but we still have lots of questions. Let me try to put one or maximum two questions. One is like Australia-European Union trade talk is delayed because of this all episode. So how it's going to impact France's relation with Australia, US, UK, as well as European Union's relation with those countries?
I think I may already answered the first part. With the US, we hope to resume cooperation. With the UK and Australia, it's more complicated, especially with Australia. I think this is the biggest problematic situation. And actually, the day before, 2 days ago, our foreign minister called for a complete review of our relation with Australia. So it's quite strong words, and we can expect that our cooperation will be strongly impacted by that crisis. When it comes to the EU, I think the biggest question is how can Europeans trust these three countries? Because this breach of trust is not just about France, it's about Europeans at large. We have complicated relations with the UK because of Brexit. We have more and more episodes of tensions with Washington, with Afghanistan, now with AUKUS. With Australia also, it's clearly an important crisis. So it could impact the broader relationship between Europe, the US, the UK, and Australia. And again, it's not the role of Europeans to demonstrate that these countries could be trusted. It's their call, and they have to make the first positive steps. I'm quite optimistic about the US. And actually yesterday there was this Trade and Tech Council in Pittsburgh between European officials and US officials, which was quite a fruitful discussion. So cooperation is there. With the UK, it's clearly complicated. With Brexit, relations are really at a low point. And with Australia, it's still to be determined.
Pierre Morcos, thank you so much for your interesting discussion. We learned a lot. I'm sure our participants also immensely benefited from it. We still have lots of questions, but we have to end it here. We'd like to have you again in future, maybe in real in Kathmandu.
Sure.
I'd also like to thank all our participants for their interesting questions. Morcos, have a nice day and good night to our friends from Asia.
Thank you so much. Have a nice evening and a good weekend. Goodbye.
Thank you. Thank you so much for your time. Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.